Microsoft released research that registered what jobs are most vulnerable to AI. And topping the list were translators and historians. Now, I'm a translator. I've translated Proclus's Elements of Theology from the Greek to the Portuguese. And I've translated essays by Vicente Ferreira da Silva from Portuguese to English. And constantly in my work in the history of philosophy, I'm translating primary sources into English, primarily, and also into Portuguese. But in any case, translation is part of what I do, and also history is part of what I do. And so this naturally has caused me to reflect. And today I want to talk about specifically one feature that I think of our standard translation practices that particularly makes philosophical translation in the history of philosophy vulnerable to being replaced or substituted in some sense by AI. And that is our habit of separating neatly between translation and interpretation. And going along with this, a way of translating central terms in our philosophers with a standard jargon. So, for instance, we'll translate psyche as soul or nous as intellect and similar things. And the reason we do this is because our translations are generally mostly directed towards other philosophers, and usually towards other philosophers who are also studying philosophers from our period, who have some background in this terminology and who have some background in the Greek. And so when we say, for instance, intellect for referring to a philosopher like Proclus or Plotinus or Aristotle or Plato, we don't necessarily mean what we would mean when we were speaking in other contexts in English with intellect. We wouldn't necessarily mean something like mental ability, a general capacity to understand things, or an abstract capacity to understand things. There might be some cases where we mean that, but generally we're just using the word as a placeholder for the Greek. We're just using it as a placeholder for nous. Now, this is not only unproblematic for these reasons. It doesn't hurt that we're using this technical vocabulary since we understand what's behind it, but it's also very useful if what we're interested in is tracking the way a certain term is used throughout centuries of debate. And so when we use, for instance, intellect to translate, nous in Proclus's Elements of Theology, when he says that every nous thinks or itself, noe itself, and then again, thinking here for knowing is also just a standard jargon translation. Doesn't necessarily have to do with our human mental activities that we refer to with thinking. When we do this, we immediately connect this claim in the Elements of Theology back to claims that we can see in Aristotle about the first unmoved mover being thought thinking itself, and other things like that. And it allows us also, since we use intellect here, it allows us then to also connect this forward with Latin discussions about intellectus, or Arabic discussions about akal. And so it's very useful for when our question is, how do these arguments, how do these texts relate to these other texts? And that's really the problem here, because as long as our concern is to connect text to text, that is precisely the area where these machines excel, right? The point is, as long as all we're doing is organizing this mass of texts and relating one text to others, that's precisely what AI is here to do and is getting better and better and better at. And so, as I said, this goes together with a distinction between translation and interpretation. Of course, you can't entirely separate the two. You have to have some understanding of the text when you're translating. However, for instance, if someone had a very specific idea of nous, for instance, that in Proclus, for instance, when you study Proclus' theory of nous and you come to the conclusion that actually a nous for Proclus is a kind of providence. It's a kind of separately existing eternal knowledge that has a causal role in this world, organizing it. You would generally still, translate nous as intellect, and you would however, you then write a separate paper saying, well, actually, what Proclus means by intellect is providence. And in that way, we separate this in part because we say, well, we don't want to reduce what the text says to our own interpretation of it because it's less secure. And also, we want to recognize that when we're translating, there could be other interpretations, other conclusions drawn, and so we want to preserve the ambiguity, preserve the richness of the text, as we say. And I mean, I have independent reasons to question these ideas. So I mean, texts are rich, texts are really rich, unfathomably rich, but reality is richer. And when we arrive at a conclusion that, nous is providence, we might no longer, if we translate nous as providence, we might be severing some textual ties that this text has, and we might be severing some of the richness of this text, qua text. However, we are connecting it to something that's much richer, which is reality, right? Because now, if Proclus' debates about nous are actually debates about, questions about the problem of evil, about fate, about how can there be this eternal knowledge that acts on the world, questions that today are connected with providence and the philosophy of religion and things, then by translating nous as providence, we'll be inserting Proclus into these contemporary debates about these real issues in metaphysics and the philosophy of religion. And so we lose, I think, we'll be losing some of the richness of the text as a text, but we'll be inserting it into something much richer, which is our reality and our investigation into it. But even setting that aside, it's by keeping our focus just on preserving the text, we're basically cutting ourselves off from reality, and we're staying to the domain where the AI will excel. Whereas the connection with reality, the connection with what these words really mean, what the philosopher, when he uses these words, is trying to grasp in the world, that's the step that the AI can't take. And that's what then is incumbent on us to include more and more in our translations as what we can uniquely do as human beings, as philosophers reading ancient texts. And so, I mean, there are problems with this. I mean, sure, it's true that other people have other interpretations of the text and that they'll then interpret key terms differently. But that just means that we'll have more translations, and I think that's a good thing. It's also one of the things that creates an idea of scarcity in translation, is the idea that is the idea that we can only have one of something, and when that's obviously not true. It's always a benefit when there are multiple translations of a single text, and we're not and AI, and if anything, it leads us to a time when having multiple texts about something is more and more common, or it's ushering into a kind of new abundance of textuality. So that's not for me, it's not a serious objection. But okay, so in general, that's my thoughts. I think that AI is causing us to rethink a lot about how we work in the university and how all our professions work. And I think here, and specifically with regard to philosophical translations, it can provoke us to perhaps bring together more our interpretations and our translation practices, and rethink about how we deal with central terms like nous and psyche when we're reading specific philosophers.